Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 31st of May of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video I would like to start with very interesting article that was published by the Western media. So let's discuss this in details. The Russian armed forces took 18 settlements, almost 200 square kilometers in 7 days. That was stated by Bild. Russian troops are demonstrating the most active advancement in the DPR, Kharkiv and Sumy regions. According to the publication's experts, the Ukrainian armed forces are unable to stop the offensive due to an acute shortage of personnel which cannot be eliminated in the near future. In addition, Russia's numerical superiority in infantry is having an increasingly noticeable impact on the situation at the front. So this is the statement of the Western media, and right now something like this is happening. The Russians are advancing along the Sumy region and along the Kharkiv region, and now we see that the Ukrainians can't do anything with this. And I'll remind you that during the previous weeks the Ukrainians were forced to redeploy a lots of units, a lots of brigades, a lots of probably vehicles, tanks and so on in the direction of the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka arc with the purpose to stabilize the situation. At least we got reports that Ukrainians were forced to redeploy the units of the 36th Marine Brigade, the units of the 44th Marine Mechanized Brigade, 82nd Air Assault Brigade, and many other brigades were redeployed in this area. And now we see that the Russians, of course, the Russians were slowed down a bit. Now the Russians are not showing the progress they used to show us a week or 2 weeks ago. But we discussed this many times that the Ukrainians managed to slow down and probably destabilize the situation at least a little bit, but they were forced to do this. They were forced to sacrifice the Sumy direction, Kharkiv direction in favor of Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka arc. The Russians currently use the situation in their favor and they continue offensive operation, trying to get as close as possible to the city of Sumy itself. And now let's talk about the city of Sumy and the Sumy direction first of all. According to information we have, and during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly along the border. The pro-Russian resources, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces North stated that as a result of clashes, the Russians managed to secure the villages of Vodolahy and the village of Alexeyevka. So as for the end of the 31st of May of 2025, we have lots of changes on the ground that were provided by different mappers, probably based on the reports of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation and the Group of Forces North. But when talking about videos, we haven't received anything that can confirm Russian progress on the ground. Furthermore, several sources reported that during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the village of Kondratyevka. Most likely tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation will also confirm this situation. So once again, let's compare the maps. For example, this is the situation that you can see right now in front of your screens, is the situation by the end of the 31st of May of 2025. Yesterday, we had completely different picture. All these territories, as you can see, used to be considered either under complete control of the Ukrainian forces or in contested area. Yesterday we got just one video from this area. Let's take a look at this video. Here we can see how the Russians were destroying a temporary deployment point of the armed forces of Ukraine to the west of the village by the name of Alexeyevka. And today almost every single square kilometer in this area was colored in Russian favor. So we are waiting for additional videos. Obviously, as for now, we are going to keep the map as is, but once again we adjusted the map and almost every single pro-Russian resource adjusted their own map, but without any videos that can confirm Russian progress on the ground. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to very reliable sources, the Russians continued their offensive operation in the village by the name of Yunakievka during the previous 24 hours. According to several mappers, the Russians secured around 50% of the village and the Russian offensive operation continues. The Russians are not going to stop. The most interesting thing is what exactly the Russians are going to do next. Furthermore, according to information we have, according to pro-Ukrainian sources, Deep State, the Russians began another offensive operation, but as for the eastern direction of the city of Sumy, the Russians are advancing in the direction of the village by the name of Novopil, trying to shorten the distance as soon as possible. We discussed this operation during the previous days. Probably during the previous 48 hours, we got several reports from pro-Russian resources that they began offensive operation here. Furthermore, I'll remind you that according to several sources, the Russians are attacking the village of Miropolskoe as well. So Miropolye is not the only area in the eastern part of Sumy region where the Russians began offensive. Anyway, we need to understand and we need to always keep in our minds that the Russians currently are in attacking. They're moving, they're improving their positions, but the biggest thing and the biggest problem the Russians are about to face is a huge forest between the city of Sumy itself and the border with the Russian Federation. We are talking about this territory, and obviously this is going to be very difficult for the Russians to go through this forest. I'll remind you that since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians have had lots of examples, lots of experience of clashes in forests. Since the beginning of 2022, the Russians have fought with the Ukrainians in the vicinity of the settlement by the name of Izum. We have very huge forest in this area and further in the southern directions to the city of Slaviansk. Currently, there are still very heavy clashes in the Serebryanka forest, but you know what? That's since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians weren't so successful in fighting for forests. The Russians are very slow in these areas. So which means that when talking about, for example, forest around the city of Izum and in the vicinity of the city of Siversk, this forest is 2 or 3 times less than the forest in front of the city of Sumy. So this is a very huge area, and telling the truth, if you ask my opinion, if the Russians decided to attack the city of Sumy through this forest, I believe that, telling the truth, it can take years before the Russians are able to walk through this forest and to get the city of Sumy itself. So that is why I believe and we expect that the Russians are not going to do this, because today we got very important report that was published by pro-Ukrainian sources and Ukrainian administration. According to information we have, the Ukrainians announced evacuation of this area. So every single settlement in this area will be evacuated by the Ukrainians during the next 24-48 hours. And when talking about the situation, obviously there are several reasons why the Ukrainians decided to evacuate people from this area. For example, the most obvious is that there is no forest in this area, so that is why the Ukrainians in the very near future are planning to mass their troops in this area with the purpose to have something like a defense belt in front of Russian offensive. And this is the first reason. The second one is that Ukrainians are trying to evacuate civilians to reduce losses. But another reason why the Ukrainians announced evacuation from this territory, of course, first of all, to concentrate their own troops in this region, and the most important reason is that the Russians most likely are not going to advance in the direction of the forest. The Russians most likely will try to outflank the city of Sumy and the forest itself from the northwest and from the west. First, by this attack and by this maneuver, most likely the Russians will try to cut the railways between the city of Sumy and the city of Kiev. These railways Ukrainians still use to supply and support their contingent in this area, and the Russians by this attack can cut the city of Sumy from supply. And most likely the Russians are, if the Russians are going to act like this, most likely in the very near future we should expect another offensive operation, but this time to the south of this forest in the direction of the same railways, but this time the part of the railways that connects the city of Sumy and the city of Kharkiv. So most likely we are going to see something like this. But obviously nothing like this may happen because, first of all, the president of the Russian Federation several weeks ago told us that Russia was going not to take the entire Sumy region, but to create a secure zone. So probably and maybe the forest and the outskirts of the forest is already a secure zone. So maybe the Russians are not going to move even further or deep inside of the territory of Sumy region. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. Obviously, everything depends on whether the Ukrainians are able to stop or to slow down the Russians. But when talking about the article that was published by Bild, we see that Ukrainians currently are unable to stop the offensive, which means that the Russians will continue until the Ukrainians are able to stop them, which can happen anywhere, not even in the Sumy region, but even in the Poltava region or in the vicinity of the city of Kiev. So let's wait and see. Now let's talk about the northeastern part of the Kharkiv region. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of icons in this area. The Russians intensified their aviation and artillery activities. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions along the entire line of combat contact, starting from the settlement of Kazachya Lopань and ending in the vicinity of the city by the name of Bely Kolodys. So as you can see, all these territories under very heavy fire from the Russian side. We expect that the Russians by this attack are carrying out something like artillery preparation before further attempts to cross the river of Volcha with the purpose to establish complete control over the city of Volchansk. We are waiting for additional changes in this area. Now let's talk about the most northeastern part of Kharkiv region. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions. This was reported by several neutral mappers. The Ukrainians are trying to stabilize the situation in this area by sending more and more forces in this direction, but from the other side, the Ukrainians understand that this is a secondary direction that has no value for Ukraine, and for Ukrainians it's better to save personnel and to save vehicles, not to allow the Russians to destroy it, and to stick as close as possible to the city of Kupiansk itself. So which means we believe that the Russians most likely will not face any resistance in this area. Furthermore, during the previous 24 hours we got very interesting geolocations from this side of the border between Russia and Ukraine. The Russians published this video where we can see lots of artillery strikes and FPV drone attacks on Ukrainian positions along the line of combat contact, including along the border between Russia and Ukraine. So these two FPV drone attacks means that maybe the Russians have a plan to begin offensive operation in this area. If the Russians begin advancing along this border line, this can lead the Russians to cut the entire direction for several pieces, and then the Russians will handle with every single piece separately. Now let's talk about the city of Kupiansk itself. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and the Ukrainian contingent on the territory of the settlement. Today we got additional clarifications regarding Russian progress in the northern part. I'll remind you that yesterday several sources reported that the Russians entered the northern part of the city of Kupiansk. Today we got additional details about that attack. The Russians didn't enter the city of Kupiansk itself, but the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of the village by the name of Golubovka. So these facilities were taken by the Russians during the previous 24 hours. The Russians managed to tighten the news around the Ukrainian positions in the village of Golubovka, and currently the distance between Russian edge positions and the village of Oskol around the settlement of Golubovka is less than 1.5 kilometers, which means that the Russians are going to attack in this area in the very near future. This will allow the Russians to maintain the lines in the northern part of the city of Kupiansk, and this will allow the Russians to improve their logistic and to connect Golubovka, Redkadub and Kindrashevka with the settlement of Sinkovka. This is going to be a very powerful foothold to the north of the city of Kupiansk, starting from the northwest and ending in the northeast. Now let's move further. As for the southern Kupiansk direction or the Liman area, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special. The Ukrainians introduced additional forces around the Russian positions with the purpose to stabilize the area. The Russians began using lots of drones and Ukrainians suffered huge losses, as you can see according to this video. When talking about the Sivas direction during the previous 24 hours, we got lots of videos how the Russians intensified their artillery strikes in the triangle between the villages of Serebryanka, Grigorovka and the city of Siversk itself. If you take a look at this map, you're going to see lots of videos, lots of episodes how the Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian positions. So this concentration of fire means that the Russians have some plans to begin offensive operation in the very near future. We believe that the Russians will try to shorten the distances to the villages of Serebryanka and Grigorovka within the next 48-72 hours. Now let's talk about the Konstantinovka direction. According to information we have, the Russians by the end of the 31st of May established control for over more than 80% of the city of Volchansk. Basically, the Russians are about to finish the battle for this territory. We expect that Ukrainians are no longer able to hold their positions in this southwestern part of the city, and that in the very near future the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back towards the next defense belt. As for the Kliban-Bykska direction, according to several mappers, the Russians during the previous 24 hours managed to improve their positions in the pocket between the village of Romanovka and Zarya. So additional territories were taken by the Russians. The most interesting is that today pro-Ukrainian sources also confirmed additional progress on the ground. And according to pro-Ukrainian sources, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village of Gnatovka, and the Russians continue their offensive operation further. When talking about the situation along N32 road, we see that the Russians stop advancing further in the northern and the northwestern directions. As we discussed in the previous videos and as we discussed during the previous days, the Ukrainians brought additional forces in this direction, like 44th Mechanized, like 36th Marine Brigade, and many other battalions were redeployed in this direction. And due to this redeployment, most likely the Ukrainians managed to stabilize the situation, but that forced Ukrainians to sacrifice with many other directions, like northeastern part of Kharkiv and the border along with Sumy region. Furthermore, the Russians, when talking about this area, continue their offensive, especially in the area of Yelizavetovka, Mirolubovka, and Malinovka. Today, this information was confirmed both by pro-Russian resources and by pro-Ukrainian resources. According to information we have, this pocket is about to collapse, and the Russians are about to secure this territory completely. As soon as the Russians take this territory under complete control, they will maintain the lines, and then the Russians will be able to begin offensive in the direction of the city of Novoekonomichna. When talking about the South Donetsk direction, during the previous 24 hours, the most important updates are coming from the village of Alexeyevka. Today, Ukrainian sources of 46th Brigade published this video where we can see how Ukrainians were attacking and FPV droning Russians in this area. In this video, we can see several FPV drone attacks in the most eastern part of the village, which means that the Russians managed to enter the settlement, and currently the Russians continue offensive operation further in the western direction. So this is very important because the battle for the last stronghold on the Novopavlovka direction has begun. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their artillery activities in the vicinity of Fedorovka. We believe that this is something like artillery preparation, and we expect that during the next 48 hours the Russians will begin their offensive operation with the purpose to take this village under complete control. And this is the last village on the way to the settlement of Kamar. When talking about the Gulay Pole direction, we got probably the most important update from this area. The Russian sources today published this video, and in this video we can see how Russians were fighting for the settlement of Novopil. In this video we can see lots of artillery strikes, FPV drone attacks, several ammo depots were destroyed, and in the final part of this video we can see how Russians raised their flag. I'll remind you that several days ago the Russians published almost the same video from the village of Zelenoye Pole. 2 days or 3 days ago we saw almost similar episodes how the Russians were attacking the village, and in the final part of that video the Russians raised their flags as well. So now we have no doubts that both villages were taken by the Russians completely, and that the Russians are going to move further in the western direction. The next stop for the Russians is the village of Timirovka. Most likely during the next 72 hours the first Russian sabotage and reconnaissance group would be discovered in the vicinity of this village. Now let's discuss the situation in the Zaporozhye direction, and today we got a very interesting statement that was made by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armored Forces of Ukraine, Syrsky. Russian army launched an offensive in the Zaporozhye direction. There is a significant activity there, Syrsky emphasized. He also added that Russian troops are now concentrating their main efforts on the Pokrovsky, Toretsky, Limansky, Novopavlovsky directions, as well as on the border areas of the Sumy region. So Syrsky stated that the Russians began moving in the northern direction with the purpose to outflank the city of Orekhov probably from the west with the purpose to cut supply lines, and the Russians began advancing in the direction of Orekhov from the southeast. As for the southeastern direction, we have lots of videos how the Russians were bombing the settlement of Mala Takmachka, probably reducing Ukrainian defense capabilities. When talking about the western flank, the main activities we expect to the south of the village of Stepnogorsk. If we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of May, we're gonna receive the biggest number of Russian strikes exactly to this micro district by the name of 3rd micro district. Here we can see how the Russians basically were reducing this territory to ruins. We expect that this small Ugledar in the southern part of Stepnogorsk is the main task and priority of the armored forces of the Russian Federation. If the Russians establish complete control over this high-rise building area, this can lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense on the Zaporozhye direction, because from these positions the Russians would be able to control the territory around. So something big is brewing on the Zaporozhye direction, but several military experts reported that the main purpose of the Russians to begin offensive operation in this area with the purpose to force the Ukrainians to always keep lots of reserves in this direction, which will ease Russian progress on some other direction like Pokrovsk or Sumy or Kharkiv or Siversk. And that's it for today. Military with Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.